Happy New Year and welcome to In Touch with Durham County. I'm Deborah Craig-Ray, General Manager of Strategic Planning and Innovation. Joining me is our co-host, Wendy Jacobs, Chair of the Board of County Commissioners.
Thank you, Deborah. We use this program to share vital information about the wonderful services and programs provided by Durham County Government.
Well, I'll say we have a very interesting show to kick off 2019. EMS Officer Joe Slattery and Assistant Chief of Clinical Affairs Lee Van Vleet of our Emergency Medical Services join us to talk about our Community Paramedic Program and a fantastic new state-of-the-art EMS Training Center. Beginning in 2020, federal agencies will enforce tougher security standards at airport check-ins, federal buildings, military installations, and more. In our second segment, we will hear from Patrice Bethea, Public Relations Officer with the North Carolina Department of Transportation, about the Real ID program. Chair Jacobs, let's begin our discussion.
So thank you so much, Joe and Lee, for being here with us today. Can you tell us about what is the EMS Training Center?
Well, thanks to the county, we have a new administration building where we have a 3-room sim lab and a control room up on the 5th floor, along with a new classroom for our new hire academies. It's a beautiful facility. They designed the simulation labs. We have them currently set up as a 1-bedroom apartment. Where this is Steve, he lives in the apartment there, and they set up the lab with one-way mirrors so we can watch all types of simulation training, and it's really a fascinating facility.
Wow.
Yeah.
So since you mentioned Steve sitting here, if you could please introduce us to Steve and to our viewers who might be wondering who this is sitting here.
Steve is a Gamard trauma HAL mannequin. He is a high-fidelity simulator mannequin that we use in many different types of training. Steve, how are you today?
Hi, thank you for having me here. I appreciate it.
So as you can see, Steve, he talks, he blinks. We can perform pretty much any assessment that we would do on a live patient. We can practice on our simulator. We can hook him up to our cardiac monitor. We can start IVs and run IV fluids through him and give him medications. And he's controlled by an operator. So while we're practicing and doing our training, he can actually make the patient's condition change. We can make him get better, we can make him get worse. And he is the state-of-the-art in high-fidelity simulation training.
Well, this is just amazing, really amazing. So, Steve, we're glad to have you here with us today. And how, you alluded to a little bit, but how do these simulations help our EMS staff to prepare to take care of residents in Durham?
It's a great question. What we do, especially in the new Simulab that we have, is we can recreate just about anywhere in the county. So we can recreate a scene outside, or we can recreate a scene inside. We can set up the sim labs like a nursing facility, which we do go to quite often, or we can set it up like a patient's home, an office. We can put cubicles in there and have somebody sitting at their cubicle. And what we do with the mannequins is we recreate what we call high acuity, low frequency emergencies. So we can make him very sick and something that our employees wouldn't see on a daily basis. But it gives them the exposure to somebody who is incredibly sick, and it gives them that ability to remember what happened during that call. And we also use him for our new hire academies. They'll see between 60 and 100 simulations before they even go out and hit the road. So we'll put him in many different environments, and as a matter of fact, tomorrow we're taking him up to Eno Park, where we will be running and practicing cardiac arrest management.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So is the training strictly for EMS workers or for the community?
So we actually partner with Durham City Fire. Well, it's all Durham City Fire now, so right. Sorry. But we've worked with Lebanon Fire, Bahama Fire, and the Sheriff's Office, and we do a bunch of training with them. We even did some training with the FBI last year. So, yeah, We do take him to show and tells as well. The kids love to play with him.
Yeah. So how often do you get to use him?
He gets used about 4 days a week.
Okay.
Yeah. I need 1 day in the office to kind of set up training for the next week, but he'll see probably, Steve, what do you say? You run about 5 to 10 scenarios a day?
Yeah, it's exhausting, but I love it.
Along with Steve, we do have child mannequins, we have baby mannequins, we have a baby birthing mannequin. But Steve is our top of the line, so I wanted to introduce you to him today.
Wow, so it's really an honor to get to meet with you, Steve. How does this improve the clinical care provided to the community by working with Steve?
It allows us to expose especially our newer employees, but also on a annual basis. It allows our employees to see those emergencies that they don't see every day. And it's really the ones that, kind of even as EMS scare us a little bit, So it allows them the ability to get their hands on, in their own time and in a safe environment, work through a very sick person so that they gain that experience. As a matter of fact, our cardiac arrest day, there was a horrible event last year where a young girl died up in Bahama. The paramedic who was running that call had seen that exact scenario twice in training with us. Wow. So when she actually got to the call, it was smooth and she did everything. And so that's really where the benefit of it all is.
Excellent.
Well,
Excellent.
I have to mention, because I know it's going to be hard for our viewers to know this, but Steve's chest is actually rising and falling. I'm hearing him breathing right now, along with his eyes blinking. But the remarkable thing is I can hear him breathing as I'm sitting next to him. So
Totally lifelike.
It's just amazing. So can you tell us what the Community Paramedic Program is all about?
So the Community Paramedics is a pilot program funded by the county. It's about right at a year old now. And we have a supervisor and 2 community medics that are able to focus on kind of non-traditional aspects of patient care, working on essentially the whole patient rather than just the acute medical emergency that is typically part of our EMS world. We've receiving direction from the board, focused on a couple of key patient types, and really what we want to do is address those patients' needs in their home rather than have them transported to the emergency department and tie up unneeded resources, or rather needed resources unnecessarily, when we can address those problems better in the home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you kind of touched on that. I just wanted to kind of drill down a little bit about what types of patients do you typically go and visit, and what's the routine?
So we see a wide variety, but we're trying to focus primarily on our familiar faces, the people that we see most often, that have called 911, say, more than 4 times in the past month, and go and meet with those patients and enroll them in our program and find out, is there a need that we can address in the home, like medication management or dealing with their chronic health care issues, getting them in to see a primary care physician rather than just transport to the emergency department and continue to overload the ED and overload the EMS system. So we're hoping to primarily decrease our 911 volume with that. Our second key area of focus is the narcotic overdose patient. As I'm sure everyone's aware, there's certainly an opioid problem in the United States right now, and Durham is no different. We have our share of that. So our community paramedics not only are trained as any other paramedic to deal with an acute overdose, but they respond after the overdose. So if we had an overdose at a particular location last night, today we'll send the community paramedic back to that location, hopefully meet with the patient, offer them further resources to help address their substance use disorder. And we also provide naloxone kits, which is a medication, of course, that can reverse narcotic overdose. So those are our two primary areas, the familiar faces and narcotic overdose right now.
Yeah. So what's the difference between a regular paramedic and then the community paramedic?
So the community paramedics are all experienced street paramedics. So they bring that same set of advanced life support skills to the scene that a paramedic working on the ambulance does. But they also have some additional training in dealing with those non-traditional aspects of the patient's health care, the chronic health care issues like heart failure, diabetes. They've also received additional training in wound care, medication reconciliation and management, that sort of thing, to really expand their skill base. So they're not really doing the typical 911 paramedic's job, although they are capable of that. And as they're out in the community, if they are closer to an acute emergency, they'll respond to that call as well. So they can be another set of hands on that scene, or maybe a set of hands on that scene faster. Plus, our community paramedics have attended additional training at Fayetteville Technical Community College. There's a good community paramedic program in Cumberland County, and we've had the benefit of learning from them and getting our folks through that program as well.
Well, I'm very excited about the Community Paramedics Program, and I know that they have been involved with our Durham Joins Together, which is our countywide effort to address substance and medication misuse, and we just got a funding to do a pilot with EMS about what you talked about, that point of contact, and how the community paramedics can really help people get into treatment and help support them after that first initial contact. So how do you partner with other community organizations like Durham Joins Together? What are some other opportunities?
Durham Joins Together is actually a great example, and thank you for all your work on getting us that grant. So obviously we're in the very initial stages of that, but hopefully by March of 2019 we'll have something hitting the street. And that, for one example of working not just under the Durham Joins Together umbrella, but also with Alliance Behavioral Health Care and the Recovery Response Center, we hope to be able to bring peer support specialists to the scenes of these overdose patients. So either at the time of an acute overdose that we've reversed, so we can offer that patient additional resources, or at the time they're discharged from the emergency department, we can show up, and those we think are the key teachable moments for the overdose patient in that post-overdose environment. And there are a plethora of other agencies. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention them, and I can't remember all of them, but Open Table Ministry, Urban Ministry, Healthcare for the Homeless, the clinic run by Lincoln Community Healthcare Center, the Durham Rescue Mission, Freedom and Hope Center, Healing with Care, of course, Recovery Response Center, Carolina Outreach Behavioral Urgent Care. One of the other things our community paramedics work on is helping to direct patients in a behavioral crisis into the, so you're right, Steve, we want to direct those patients in a behavioral health crisis to the appropriate resource, which isn't always the emergency department. So it's not necessarily good for the patient or the system to put them in the ED when they can go to something like Carolina Outreach and get the care they need. So we're hopefully really doing the right thing for the community all around, and with the support of the board and the county to make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great. So we're about out of time. Very quickly, how can residents get in touch with you all for more information?
911 is always a good start for us.
That was an easy one. Well, thank you guys so much, and Steve, for sharing this great information and for all you do to improve the health of our community. We're going to take a quick break, and on the other side, we'll hear from Patrice Bethea, NCDOT, about North Carolina's Real ID. Stay tuned.
Beginning in October 2020, you will need two forms of ID to fly, unless you have a passport or North Carolina Real ID. Completely optional, a Real ID is a traditional driver license or ID card with a gold star. It can also be used for visiting military bases, where it is already required. To obtain your first Real ID, visit the DMV in person with documents that verify your identity and permanent address. Find out more about Real ID and how to get one at ncrealid.gov.
Welcome back. Chair Jacobs, let's continue our conversation.
Patrice, thank you for joining us here today. And can you tell us what is a real ID and why is it being implemented?
Yes. So a Real ID is a new single form of identification that is required from the Federal Real ID Act. The Real ID Act was established by Congress after September 11th, and it requires every state to issue identification that meets some new federal identification requirements. They are more strict and more secure.
So is this mandatory then?
Real ID is not mandatory in the state of North Carolina, but North Carolina is required by federal law to offer Real ID to every North Carolina resident.
So will a North Carolina Real ID driver's license and ID card look different from a standard North Carolina driver's license?
A Real ID actually looks a lot like a standard license or identification card or learner permit. The only difference is that it has a star in the upper right-hand corner. So that's the clear indicator. Non-Real IDs at this point say not for federal identification on there, so it's the exact opposite.
So explain some situations where the Real ID would be helpful.
So beginning October 1st, 2020, if you don't have a star on your license that indicates it is a Real ID, you will need to take additional documentation with you every time you fly, every time you visit a federal facility or a military base. So if you're a frequent flyer, you don't have a passport, which is considered a federal ID already, you'll have to start taking extra identification. So it may be helpful to continue to use just your license as you always have once you have the star added to it. If you have family in the military, perhaps you're going to go on base, visit them, graduations, that sort of thing, their identification requirements are changing as well. And so you may want to check in with them in advance to find out what documents you need if you don't have a star on your license to indicate North Carolina has verified you are who you say you are, you live where you say you live, and they've given you a Real ID to indicate that.
So this is very much tied to federal standards and regulations.
Yes, ma'am. It is a federal law. North Carolina does not want to force anybody to come back into the driver license office if they don't have to, which is why it is optional in North Carolina. We recognize there are people who won't ever fly, and there are people who don't have any business at a military base or any other federal facility like a nuclear power plant or a federal courthouse. And because of that, we don't want to put that burden on them to have to go and obtain a Real ID if they don't need one. But it is federal law, and every single state is doing this.
So will minors need to have a Real ID driver's license or ID card to fly domestically?
If a minor is flying alone, that means summertime, they're going to visit the grandparents, or if they have trips for spring break with their schools, if they are going to fly without an adult, they will need to provide the appropriate documentation to meet the Real ID Act. Or they can just go get a Real ID. It is available as an identification card, and we have had people come in with their very young children to go ahead and get their Real IDs in advance. Otherwise, if they're traveling with family, they will fall under the requirements for the adult they're traveling with.
Okay. So what documents do people need to bring with them to go get a Real ID?
The most important question. Obtaining a Real ID is a lot like getting your license for the very first time. You need to come back to the driver license office and verify with the DMV your residency and your identity. So you'll need 4 or 5 documents. First, you need to verify your identity and date of birth, and that could be your certified birth certificate or a valid passport. You'll also need to verify that you have a full Social Security number. So there are 4 documents you can bring for that. Your Social Security card, you could bring in a 1099 tax form or a W-2. And then finally, you'll also need to verify that you live at the address you say you live. So you'll need 2 documents to verify your address. And then there is one special caveat for anyone who has had a name change. That means you bring in your certified birth certificate, but today you have a different name perhaps because you were married. You'll need to bring in documents that verify that name change, because again, we have to verify who you are, just like you're getting a license for the very first time. But once you do that the first time, you won't have to bring them in again.
Right.
So will we need to get this new Real ID right away?
You don't need to rush and get the Real ID at this very moment. The law goes into effect October 1st, 2020 for all federal entities. There are some military bases that have already started enforcing the law, Camp Lejeune being one of those in the U.S. Marine Corps. So those are some places that you may need to go ahead and check with them in advance. The key is, again, without a Real ID, you'll have to provide additional documentation to verify who you are. And each of these federal entities determines what that documentation is. So you need to call them in advance. Ultimately, the Real ID will make it a bit easier for you to travel and visit, these federal facilities. Anyone who has a license that will expire in between now and October 1st, 2020, just plan to renew your license once you receive that reminder in the mail. You have 6 months to renew your license. You don't have to wait until your birthday or your birth month. You can go ahead and renew it 6 months in advance. If you have a passport, continue to use your passport for both your domestic and international travel until it's time for you to renew your card. And then finally, if you travel but you don't have a passport and your expiration date is not until after October 1st, 2020, go ahead and make an appointment now to obtain your Real ID, and it'll just be $13.
Yeah. So can you do this online?
Your first Real ID you cannot get online. You do need to go to a driver license office. You can just do a walk-in visit, or you can make an appointment. Once you get that first Real ID in the office, you can then renew online. You can order duplicates online, and the star will remain with your license.
Gotcha. Okay.
So right now, if you have a passport, you could use that. But at some point, it sounds like you still would need to get the Real ID if you don't want to carry your passport around. Is that?
That is correct. And one of the things you'll have to do before every single flight, for people who fly a lot, contacting TSA every time you get ready to fly to make sure they hadn't changed their requirements can be a bit cumbersome. So you might want to consider obtaining your Real ID.
And in terms of TSA pre-check, if you have that or global entry, do you still need the Real ID?
Yes, Real ID is completely separate. Again, it goes back to these increased security standards, and the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security, wants to make sure that anyone that goes through those lines are allowed to be here in the United States, and that they have been verified. They are who they say they are. They live where they say they live, and the DMV has checked every single one of their documents to ensure that.
So for our people here in Durham County, where can they get their Real ID?
You have two offices here in Durham County, one on East Miami Boulevard and the other on South Roxborough. Visit any of those offices, but as long as you have your documentation, you can go to any driver license office in the state. You can visit any of the mobile units when they're out and about at special events. If you're on vacation at the beach, over at Outer Banks, stop by Nag's Head. You can get your Real ID there. So you're not limited to just those offices where you live.
Yeah. And so what's the cost?
It depends on when you renew your license or if you obtain your duplicate. If you're renewing, the cost is all the same. It is your normal renewal fee. If it is not time for you to renew, but you want to go ahead and obtain your Real ID now, it's just $13. That's the cost of getting a new card printed and mailed to you, a standard duplicate.
So are you all hearing any feedback from folk about it, when they show up? And
Oh yeah, the biggest thing is making sure you have the right documents, and so being able to come and have partners like Durham County across the state to help us spread the word is so very important. If people come prepared with the right documentation, they can get in and out in no time. It doesn't take nearly as long to get a Real ID as it does to gather the documentation. So that's our few words of wisdom. Just plan ahead. Go ahead and find the documents. They should be documents that you already have. There is a complete list of documentation that you can use to verify your identity and your address online at ncrealid.gov. Check the website before you come to the office. Gather all of your documents before you go, and I can assure you the examiners can get you in and out pretty quickly.
So it looks like you have some information there with you.
Yeah.
Would you like to share that?
Absolutely. So we have these Real ID brochures in all of our driver license offices, and it's also available online. So if you go to ncrealid.gov, it is a complete list of everything you'd ever want to know about Real ID, a lot of what we discussed today. But the complete list of documentation is available inside, and really the nuts and bolts, the real deal about the Real ID is also available in the brochure. Feel free to pick one of those up as you kind of prepare to visit the driver license office for your Real ID. And again, you can find that information online. If we make any changes, you better believe it, you'll find it there at ncrealid.gov.
And can people make an appointment also? How would somebody make an appointment?
Yes, so you can call the DMV and make an appointment at this time. If you visit an office and want to make an appointment to come back, you're more than welcome to do that. You can also do a walk-in visit at any time. A few helpful tips. Mondays and Fridays are the busiest days, and lunchtime hour is extremely busy. So if you do a walk-in visit, keep that in mind. But you can make an appointment, and hopefully very soon we'll have the ability to make appointments online. But for now, call the DMV at 919-715-7000, and one of our customer service agents can help you make an appointment.
Well, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you've been, moving across the state and sharing this great information with folks, and we're just really glad that you were able to come and visit us today and just help our people understand the importance of the Real ID.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and we appreciate your partnership in spreading the word.
Yep. Well, I think we've had another good show.
Yeah, we've had a great show, and thank you for coming to us from NCDOT. We appreciate your visiting with us, and I look forward to some other interesting programs in the months ahead about Durham County.
Absolutely. We'll continue to stay in touch with great information that our citizens need to stay informed. Please stay with us and come next time for In Touch with Durham County. Cheers.